When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. The night is long, the air is still. Only what must continue, continues. Steel holds what happened to it, not as choice, not as consequence in any moral sense. The metal does not decide to remember. It is changed, and the change persists. And the persistence is what is called memory when it occurs in material rather than in mind. Iron is common. Carbon is common. Together, at the right proportion, under the right conditions, they produce a material that behaves differently from either one alone. The carbon atoms occupy the spaces between iron atoms in the lattice. The crystalline arrangement that all metals form as they cool from liquid to solid. A small percentage of carbon changes the behavior of the iron substantially. More than iron alone can achieve, less than what would make it brittle. The proportion matters. The proportion is where the material begins. This is the steel before anything has been done to it, capable of what comes next, not yet what it will become. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Heat the steel. The temperature rises through measurable stages. At certain temperatures, the crystalline structure changes. The arrangement of atoms shifts into a new configuration, a different geometry, one that permits the carbon atoms to distribute more evenly through the iron lattice. This phase is not visible to the eye. The steel glows, orange, then yellow, then a brightness that contains white. But the glow is only the emission of the heat, not the structural change itself. The change is interior. The change is in the arrangement of what the steel is made of, at the scale of atoms, at the scale that no flame illuminates. The steel in this state is not what it was. It is not yet what it will be. It is in transition, a material that has released its previous structure and not yet acquired its next one. The atoms are mobile. The carbon is distributed. The geometry is open. What happens in the next seconds will determine what kind of steel this becomes, and that determination cannot be undone. This is the interval that matters, not the heating, which prepared the transition, not the cooling, which will fix the result. The interval, the steel between its histories. Place the steel into water. The surface contacts the liquid and cools immediately. The heat conducting away from the surface faster than the interior can follow. A layer of steam forms at the boundary, then collapses, then forms again as the quenching proceeds. The surface is already cooling while the core is still at temperature. The steel is not one thing in this moment. It is a gradient, a material that is simultaneously at many temperatures, cooling at different rates depending on how far each point lies from the water's reach. The surface cools fast, fast enough that the carbon atoms cannot migrate. They are fixed where the transition left them, locked into a new crystalline arrangement, a structure called martensite, which did not exist in the steel before this moment and cannot be produced by any means other than rapid cooling from the right temperature. Martensite is hard, harder than what the steel was before heating, harder than almost anything the steel could become through ordinary means. The core cools slowly. The carbon has time to redistribute. The structure it forms is different from the surface's structure, tougher, less brittle, capable of absorbing force without fracturing. What the core becomes is not what the surface becomes, though both began as the same steel, heated to the same temperature, cooled in the same water. The cooling rate divided them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. One piece of steel, two structures, the surface hard enough to hold an edge that resists deformation, the core tough enough to bend without breaking. These properties do not coexist by accident. They coexist because the geometry of the cooling, the fact that surfaces cool faster than interiors, always, in every material, by the physics of conduction, produced them together from the same operation. The hardness and the toughness are not compromises with each other. They are the same event, read at different depths. The boundary between the surface structure and the core structure is not a line. It is a zone, a region where the crystalline arrangement transitions gradually from one type to the other, where martensite gives way to the tougher structures, where fast cooling met slow cooling and the steel became neither one thing nor the other. In this zone, the grain structure is mixed. Properties are intermediate. What exists here is the record of a gradient. This boundary is visible on the finished surface, not the interior. The interior is not visible. But when the steel is polished to a sufficient fineness and then treated with a mild acid, the different crystalline structures respond differently to the acid's action. Martensite darkens differently from the structures beneath it. The boundary between them appears as a line, not sharp, not uniform, but present, a marking that runs along the length of the steel, following the contour of the cooling, tracing the path that the temperature gradient took through the material. The line is not decoration. The line was not drawn. The line is the record of the cooling, made visible by the difference in what the cooling produced. What appears is the history of the heat. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Consider what the hand that held the steel was doing, not shaping the boundary. The boundary forms according to physics, the rate of heat transfer, the thermal conductivity of the steel, the temperature of the water, the mass of the material. These are not controlled by the hand. They are set by the material and the conditions, and within those conditions they proceed as they must. The hand controlled the conditions, the temperature of the heating, the timing of the quench, the moment when steel met water, which determines how much of the high temperature structure was present to be fixed by cooling, the geometry of the steel before the quench, which determines how thick the cross-section is at each point, which determines how fast each point cools, which determines how far the hard surface structure penetrates before the slower cooling core structure takes over. The hand designed the conditions under which the material transformed itself. The transformation was not the hand's work. The transformation was the steel's response to what the hand arranged. There is a kind of making that does not impose, that works with the tendencies of the material rather than against them, that knows what conditions produce what results and creates those conditions and then withdraws, allows the physics to complete what the preparation began. The result is not less the maker's work for having been done by the material. It is more precisely the maker's work because the maker's intention was not applied directly to the form, but to the conditions that allowed the form to emerge. The steel was not told what to become. It was placed in the circumstances that made one becoming inevitable. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The edge. Where the surface thins to its smallest cross-section, the cooling was fastest of all. Less mass to hold heat, more surface area relative to volume. The quench reached the thinnest part of the steel quickly, and the martensite there is deepest in proportion. The hard structure that forms under fast cooling penetrates further relative to the total thickness than it does in the thicker sections. The edge is where the hardness concentrates, not because hardness was placed there, because the geometry of the steel at that location produced the conditions for maximum hardness automatically. The maker knew this when the geometry was established, knew that thinning the steel at that location would produce faster cooling there, and faster cooling would produce harder steel, and harder steel at that location would hold its geometry against whatever it encountered. The edge is the consequence of a shape. The shape was chosen because of what the cooling would do with it. This is the chain. Geometry determines cooling rate. Cooling rate determines crystalline structure. Crystalline structure determines hardness. Hardness determines what the edge can do. The maker held geometry. Physics held the rest. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. After the quench, the steel is hard throughout, but hard in a way that is also fragile. Martensite, the structure that fast cooling produces, is hard enough to resist deformation but stressed. The rapid transformation from one crystalline arrangement to another created internal tensions in the material, points where the lattice is strained, where the atoms are not quite where the structure would prefer them to be. A steel in this state is capable of fracturing under impact. The hardness that makes it useful also makes it vulnerable to sudden force. Heat it again, not to the temperature of the first heating, only to a lower range, a temperature that allows the atom some mobility without dissolving the martensite entirely. Hold it there for a measured interval. Allow the internal stresses to relieve themselves, the lattice to relax slightly toward a less strained arrangement. This is called tempering. It is a reduction. The hardness decreases fractionally. The brittleness decreases more. The steel after tempering is less hard than it was after quenching. It is more itself than it was after quenching, not the self it was before the fire. That steel is gone. What the tempering produces is a new self, harder than the original, tougher than the quenched extreme, a material that did not exist before this sequence of heating and cooling and heating again, a balance that required the extremes to produce. Martensite relaxed by controlled heat is not the same as steel that was never martensite. The path through the extreme left something in the structure that the extreme then modified but did not erase. The steel remembers the quench even after tempering has softened its edge. The surface is now polished. Each stage of abrasive removes the marks of the previous stage and introduces finer marks of its own. The coarsest abrasive removes material quickly. The scratches it leaves are deep relative to what will come after, a landscape of parallel lines at a scale visible to the eye. The next stage removes those lines and leaves finer ones, visible only with attention, then finer still and finer, until the surface reaches a state where the remaining scratches are below the wavelength of visible light, where the surface has become smooth enough to reflect coherently, to return light in a direction rather than scattering it. Each stage of polishing is a removal. The surface that emerges is the steel minus its outermost layers, minus the marks of each abrasive, minus the oxidation that formed on the surface during the work. What polishing approaches, without ever reaching, is the steel itself, the arrangement of atoms at the surface, without the accumulated history of contact. Each stage removes some of that history and reveals what was beneath it. The final polish is close to the interior of the steel, the structure as the cooling fixed it, without the record of everything that has touched it since. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The polished surface catches what is near it. A candle held close returns as a point of light, small and steady. A face bends into the curvature. The room assembles itself in the convex geometry of the surface, compressed, widened, redistributed across the curve. The steel does not hold these images. It receives them and returns them, changed by the geometry of its surface, for as long as the light lasts. The boundary line appears clearly now, running along the length of the steel, tracing the history of the cooling, marking where the hard structure ends and the tougher structure begins. The acid revealed it. The polish made it legible. The cooling created it weeks or months ago, in the seconds between the heat and the water. The line was always there. The polishing found it. Consider the steel now, in the still of this room. The work is complete. The heating and quenching and tempering and grinding and polishing that produced this surface. These are past. They are the steel's history. They are present in the steel as its current condition. The martensite at the surface is still martensite. The tougher structure in the core is still the tougher structure. The boundary between them still runs its recorded path, still marks the depth the fast cooling reached before the slow cooling took over. None of this is visible to ordinary light. The line is visible. That record of the cooling gradient is legible, was made legible by the preparation of the surface. But the martensite itself is not visible. The crystal structure of the core is not visible. The internal stress relieved by tempering left no visible mark of its relief, only the material consequence, a steel that is slightly less hard than the quench alone would have left it, slightly more capable of absorbing force without fracturing. What is present is all the result of what happened. What happened is not present except as result. This is what it means for a material to hold its history, not as image, not as record in any legible sense, but as current condition. The steel is what it is tonight because of what was done to it. Remove the history and the steel does not remain. Something else remains, some other steel, with different properties, capable of different things. This steel, with these properties, this hardness, this boundary line, is the history made solid. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The room is still. The steel is present in it, mass, surface, the faint reflection of whatever light remains. The crystalline structure continues to exist inside the material, unchanged by the darkness, unchanged by the silence. The hard surface remains hard. The tough core remains tough. The boundary remains where the cooling left it. The steel is not waiting. It occupies this interval the way it occupied every previous interval, as a material with a current state, unchanged except by time and whatever the time brings into contact with it. Slow oxidation if the air reaches the surface. Slow stress relaxation in the crystal lattice if any internal tension remains to be released. Changes measured in decades or centuries, too slow to register as events, present only as the difference between what the steel is now and what it will be. The record is in the steel. The steel does not know it holds a record. The record does not require the steel to know. It is held in the arrangement of atoms in a lattice, in the depth of a crystalline structure beneath a polished surface, in the line that runs the length of the material marking where one kind of cooling ended and another began. The fire is gone. The water is gone. The hands that arrange the conditions are elsewhere. What they produce together, fire and water and hand and steel, is here, in this room, in the still air, cooling as all things cool in the night, holding in its interior a record of temperatures that no longer exist, of a gradient that lasted seconds and was fixed permanently in the structure of the material. The cooling happened once. What the cooling made persists. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The steel rests, not empty, not inert, structured. The arrangement that the heat and the cooling produced, present through every interval since, present now, present in the dark where the boundary line is invisible and the polish holds nothing but the dark and the hard surface is hard against nothing. What was made cannot be unmade by rest. What was fixed by cooling is not loosened by darkness. The record holds. Outside this room, the temperature of the air shifts by fractions of a degree as the night deepens. The steel shifts with it, expanding and contracting by amounts too small to measure without instruments, responding to the temperature as all materials respond, the lattice spacing increasing fractionally in warmth, decreasing fractionally in cold. Each cycle of day and night expands and contracts the steel by the same small amount. Each cycle leaves the crystalline structure unchanged. The martensite does not convert back to what it was before the quench. The tougher core does not forget the path it took through the high temperature phase. Thermal cycling at the range of ordinary temperatures does not reach the energies that would undo what the fire and the water made. The record is stable. This is the difference between the record in steel and other kinds of records. Words can be covered. Images can fade. what is written in the crystalline structure of a material can only be altered by returning to the conditions that produced it, by the fire again, by the water again, by the deliberate recreation of the interval that transformed it the first time. Absent those conditions, the record persists, not as something the steel is trying to preserve, as something the steel simply is. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. When night falls, the archive remains. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. The night is long, the air is still. Only what must continue, continues. Iron does not stay what it is. Left in air, in the presence of moisture, it changes, not quickly, not all at once, but steadily, at the surface first, and then inward, at the rate that the conditions permit. The change is not damage in any external sense. Nothing strikes the iron. Nothing corrodes it from outside. The change comes from within the material itself, from the tendency of iron atoms to form bonds with oxygen, a tendency that has always been present in the iron and requires only the right conditions to express itself. The conditions are almost always present. Air contains oxygen. Air contains moisture. These two, together in contact with iron, are sufficient. No extreme of temperature, no unusual chemistry. Only the ordinary atmosphere and time, and the iron's own tendency to become something other than iron. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. At the surface of the iron, where the metal meets the air, something is already happening. The iron lattice, the crystalline arrangement of iron atoms that gives the metal its properties, terminates at the surface. The atoms at the outermost layer have neighbors on one side and open space on the other. This asymmetry makes them reactive. An interior iron atom is surrounded on all sides by other iron atoms, held in a stable arrangement, bonded in every direction. A surface iron atom is bonded only inward. Outward, it faces the air, and the oxygen in the air, and the water vapor that the air carries. An oxygen molecule approaches. The surface iron atom and the oxygen atom form a bond, not through any decision. Through electrochemistry, the exchange of electrons between atoms whose outer shells are configured for exactly this exchange, iron offering what oxygen is configured to accept. The bond forms. The iron atom is no longer purely iron. It is iron combined with oxygen, a new compound, an oxide, something that did not exist in the lattice a moment before. The iron atom has not gone anywhere. It has become something else in the place it already occupied. The lattice around it adjusts. The neighboring iron atoms shift slightly in their positions. The crystalline arrangement accommodates the change. The surface is no longer purely iron surface, but a mixture. Iron where no reaction has yet occurred. Iron oxide where it has. The boundary between the two is not a line. It is a gradient, a zone of partial transformation, advancing inward at the rate that oxygen can reach fresh iron to react with. The first oxide layer changes what comes next. Iron oxide is not iron. It does not conduct electricity the way iron does. It does not bond to oxygen the way iron does. It is a different material sitting on top of the iron, and its presence changes the conditions at the surface. Oxygen arriving now does not meet iron directly. It meets oxide first. Some of it diffuses through the oxide layer, moving through the gaps between the oxide's crystalline structure, finding the iron beneath, reacting, adding another layer of oxide below the first. Some of it reacts with the oxide layer itself, changing its chemistry, converting one form of iron oxide into another. The oxide is not passive. It participates in what happens next. The oxide layer is porous. This matters. A dense, continuous oxide layer would slow the reaction significantly. Oxygen would have to diffuse through a solid barrier to reach the iron beneath. But iron oxide as it forms naturally is not dense. It is voluminous. It occupies more space than the iron it came from, because the oxygen atoms added to the structure increase its volume. This expansion causes the oxide layer to crack, to separate, to form a surface that is rough and porous rather than smooth and continuous. Through those cracks and pores, oxygen continues to reach the iron. The reaction does not seal itself. It creates the conditions for its own continuation. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The surface changes color. What appears first is not red. It is a faint yellowing, a thin oxide layer, partially transparent, through which the iron's own color still shows. The layer is too thin to obscure. It only tints. It is the beginning of a record, not yet legible as such, a first annotation on the surface of the metal. As the layer thickens, the color deepens. Yellow gives way to orange, orange to the red-brown that is most commonly called rust, the color of iron oxide in its most common hydrated form. Iron bonded to both oxygen and water, a compound that forms in the presence of moisture as readily as it forms in the presence of oxygen alone. The red-brown is thick enough to obscure the iron beneath. It is no longer a tint. It is a surface in its own right. The color is not uniform. Where moisture was most present, in a crack, at a point where water collected and held, the oxide is thickest, deepest in color, most advanced in its transformation. Where the surface was drier, the reaction proceeded more slowly, and the color is lighter, thinner, less developed. The pattern of color across the surface is a map of moisture distribution over time, not a record of any single event, but an accumulation, the aggregate effect of every hour of humidity, every contact with water, every night when the air was damp and the surface held that dampness against the iron. The surface is legible, the language is color, the text is the history of the air that touched it. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Below the surface color, the iron is still iron. The transformation has not penetrated deeply, not yet, not in the early stages of oxidation. The oxide layer is thin relative to the mass of the metal beneath it. An instrument pressed against the surface would find iron a millimeter below, iron 10 millimeters below, iron throughout most of the material's depth. The color at the surface corresponds to a layer of change that is, by any measure of mass, a small fraction of the whole. Yet the fraction grows, not quickly, The rate of oxidation is not constant. In the early stages, when the iron surface is exposed directly to the air, the reaction proceeds at its fastest. Fresh iron, unobstructed access, the full electrochemical tendency of iron for oxygen expressing itself without barrier. As the oxide layer thickens, oxygen must travel further to reach fresh iron. The rate decreases. The transformation continues, but more slowly, the oxide's own presence modifying the conditions under which the oxide forms. This is not equilibrium. Equilibrium would be a state in which the transformation had ceased, a balance between the tendency to oxidize and some countervailing force that stopped it. What is happening here is deceleration without cessation. The rate decreases, but the direction does not change. Given sufficient time, the oxide will penetrate further and further and further until no fresh iron remains near the surface, until the material has transformed throughout its depth, until what was iron is entirely oxide. This is the endpoint the process is moving toward. It moves slowly. It does not stop. In the dark interior of the metal, far below the visible surface, iron atoms occupy their lattice positions as they have since the metal was formed. They are not yet in contact with oxygen. The oxide layer above them is a path that oxygen must traverse to reach them, and the traversal is slow, and they are far from the surface, and the night is quiet, and nothing reaches them yet. They are iron still. The arrangement that cooling from liquid produced, the structure that gives the metal its properties. They will wait in this arrangement for as long as the barrier above them holds, not forever. The barrier is not impermeable. It is porous and cracked and growing, adding to itself at the bottom where oxygen reaches iron and reacting at the top where the atmosphere reaches oxide. The iron atoms at depth are not in danger in any urgent sense. Time is long, the rate is slow, but the direction is fixed. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The interior iron does not know what is happening at the surface. There is no knowing in metal. There is only the lattice, and the atoms in it, and the bonds between them, and the conditions at any given location. The presence or absence of oxygen, the presence or absence of moisture, the electrochemical potential that determines whether a reaction proceeds. The interior iron is iron because the conditions at its location have not yet permitted it to become otherwise. When the conditions change, it will change. Not because it was waiting, because the conditions will have arrived. Consider the iron over years. The oxide layer that was thin in the first months is now substantial. Color has darkened, layered, differentiated. Older oxide beneath, newer oxide above, different forms of iron oxide in different strata. Each layer a record of the conditions at the time it formed. The surface is no longer smooth. It is rough with the texture of transformation, the physical consequence of the volume expansion that cracking caused, the topography of a surface that has been continuously reorganizing itself as each new layer of oxide formed and cracked and was partially replaced. Moisture has collected in the crevices of the rough surface and accelerated the reaction there. Where the surface is deepest in texture, the oxidation is deepest in penetration. The topography of the surface and the depth of the transformation have reinforced each other. Roughness creates collection points for moisture. Moisture accelerates oxidation. Oxidation creates roughness. The surface has developed. It is not the surface it was. It retains the geometry of the original iron, the same overall shape, the same dimensions at scales larger than the oxide layer. But its surface character is entirely transformed. What was metallic is now mineral. What was smooth is now textured. What was one material is now two, the iron within and the oxide without, the boundary between them advancing inward at the rate the conditions permit. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. There is something in the color of rust at night. In daylight, the red-brown is vivid. The iron oxide absorbs the blue and green wavelengths of white light and reflects the red and orange, and the result is the color that has come to mean age, exposure, time. In low light, the vividness reduces. The color becomes darker, less saturated, the red-brown deepening towards something closer to earth, to soil, to the colors that come before color in the failing light. The surface is still transforming. Darkness does not pause the oxidation. The reaction requires oxygen and moisture, not light. The night air carries both. The surface continues its slow transaction with the atmosphere, the same transaction that has been proceeding since the iron was first exposed, the same exchange of electrons between iron and oxygen that produces oxide one molecular layer at a time. In the dark, the transformation is invisible. In the dark, everything that is happening below the threshold of perception. At the scale of atoms, at the rate of chemistry, in the space between the iron lattice and the oxygen molecule, in the moment of electron transfer that converts one into the other. The eye cannot follow this. The ear cannot follow this. What the night holds is the silence above a transformation that does not require observation. The record is being written now. The surface is different from what it was this morning by a layer of oxide thinner than light can distinguish. By morning, it will be different again, by the same imperceptible amount. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The iron over decades is a different object from the iron of its first exposure. Not in its geometry. The overall shape holds. The dimensions at scale are preserved. The object is recognizable as the same object, but in its surface character, in its composition at depth, in the properties of its outermost material, it has been replaced. The iron that was at the surface 10 years ago is now oxide. The iron that was a millimeter below the surface is now at or near the surface, newly exposed, beginning its own transaction with the air. The iron that was 10 millimeters down has moved, relatively, closer to the boundary. Every layer of iron that becomes oxide brings the next layer into contact with the conditions that will transform it. There is a kind of patience in this, not the patience of waiting. Patience implies awareness of the interval, a held readiness for what comes next. What the iron has is not patience. It is simply the property of changing slowly, of requiring time for the conditions to act, of transforming at the rate that diffusion and chemistry permit, rather than at the rate that any intention might demand. The slowness is not restraint. The slowness is the rate, and at this rate, the change is total. Given what the iron is made of and what the air contains, and the direction that electrochemistry moves in, the transformation is not a possibility. It is a trajectory, a path already determined by the nature of the materials in contact. Time does not decide the outcome. Time only determines when the outcome arrives. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The iron rests in this room. What it holds is not a record it chose to keep. The oxide layer on its surface is the physical consequence of chemistry, the accumulated result of every moment since the iron was first exposed to air, compressed into a layer of transformed material that is both the record and the change itself. The record and the change are the same thing. The oxide is what the reaction produced, and the record of the reaction is simply the oxide. Its thickness, its color, its texture, its depth of penetration into the iron beneath. Nothing was stored intentionally. Everything that is there because it could not be otherwise. Outside, the air moves at its own pace. Oxygen is present in it, as it is always present. Moisture is present in it, more or less depending on the night, depending on the season, depending on what the day brought and what it left behind. The air reaches the surface of the iron and the transaction continues. The same transaction, the same chemistry, the same slow exchange that has been proceeding since the first moment of exposure. The iron is becoming what it is becoming. Not all at once, not tonight. Over time, at the rate that the conditions permit, in the direction that the chemistry requires, without decision and without pause, the iron and the air are completing a transaction that began the moment they met and will not be finished until one of them is gone. The air will outlast the iron. This is already known, is written into the nature of the reaction, is the endpoint towards which the slow transformation has always been moving. The iron will become entirely oxide, given sufficient time, and the oxide is stable where the iron was not, and the transaction will be complete, and what was iron will be mineral, and the mineral will hold the shape the iron held, and the shape will be all that remains of what the iron was. That ending is far. Tonight the iron is still mostly iron, the oxide still a surface condition, the transformation still a fraction of the whole. The room is still. The air touches the surface. The record grows by one more layer, too thin to see, too slow to feel, present as the increment it is. One more moment of a transaction that has no urgency, no deadline, no force behind it other than the ordinary tendency of iron in air to become in time something other than iron. The transaction does not announce itself. It does not require witness. It proceeds at the pace of chemistry in the dark, as it proceeds in every interval, observed or not. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. When night falls, the archive remains. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. The night is long, the air is still. Only what must continue, continues. A ceramic vessel holds its shape until it does not. The clay was formed, fired, cooled. A process that drove out water, fused the particles, fixed the structure into something harder than what it was before the heat. The firing changed it permanently. What came out of the kiln was not the clay that went in. It was a material that could not be returned to clay by any ordinary means. A material whose structure had been set by the heat into a new arrangement. More rigid, more brittle, more capable of holding its form against the pressure of ordinary use. Brittle means capable of fracturing without first deforming. Metal bends before it breaks, it warns. The deformation is visible, the material yielding first in ways that can be seen and responded to. Ceramic does not bend. It holds its form completely until the stress exceeds what the structure can sustain. And then it does not yield. It divides. The fracture is sudden. The fracture propagates at a speed close to the speed of sound in the material. What was whole is, in a fraction of a second, no longer whole. The vessel was here. The vessel is here in pieces. Between those two states, an instant. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Consider the fracture surface. Where the vessel divided, two new surfaces were created simultaneously. The surface of one fragment and the surface of the other. Mirror images of each other, the negative and positive of the same event. Before the fracture, these surfaces did not exist. They were interior to the material, hidden inside the ceramic body, inaccessible. The fracture made them visible by separating them. The fracture surface is not smooth. A crack does not travel in a straight line through ceramic. It follows the path of least resistance. Through the weakest bonds, around the hardest inclusions, along the boundaries between crystalline grains where the material is less continuous. The path is complex. It branches and reconnects. It changes direction at microscopic scale in response to the local structure of the material. The result is a surface whose texture is a record of the material's own internal geography. The map of where the ceramic was weakest, where the bonds were fewest, where the structure was least continuous. The fracture surface is a cross-section of the vessel's interior. It shows what was inside, not as image. There is no picture in the fractured surface, but a structure, the grain boundaries, the pore distribution, the mineral inclusions, the record of how the clay particles were oriented when the vessel was formed and fired. Everything that was hidden inside the ceramic is now exposed along the fracture line. The breaking made legible what the forming concealed. The interior of the vessel was always this, the clay body, with its particular composition, its particular porosity, its particular grain structure. This existed from the moment the firing was complete. It existed while the vessel was whole, while nothing had accessed it, while it performed the function of a vessel without ever being examined at its cross-section. The fracture did not create this interior. It revealed it. What the break exposed was already there, waiting behind the surface, present as the substance of the material that the surface enclosed. The fracture is a kind of opening. not the opening the vessel was designed for. That is the mouth, the intended threshold between inside and outside. This opening is unintended, perpendicular to the vessel's axis, cutting through the wall rather than entering through the top. It is an opening that the vessel did not have before and cannot close again. The ceramic that was continuous is now divided, and division in a brittle material does not heal. The two surfaces will not rejoin by themselves. They will remain surfaces, present, exposed, the interior of the material available to the air that now reaches them, until something enters the gap. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The fragments fit together, not perfectly. The fracture created some small losses, particles that detached and dispersed, edges that were damaged by the impact, but substantially, the two surfaces that were created simultaneously by the same fracture event are complementary. The protrusion on one matches the recession on the other. The texture on one mirrors the texture on the other. The path the crack took is recorded identically on both sides of the divide. Place the fragments together and the fracture closes. Not entirely. There is a gap, the space where the lost material was, where the edges meet without touching, where the two surfaces approach each other but do not reach each other. The gap follows the path of the fracture exactly. Its width varies, narrower where the surfaces are most complementary, wider where material was lost. The gap is the shape of the loss. The gap is also the shape of what can enter it. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density, a material that can flow into this space, that can follow the path of the fracture, fill the variation in width, penetrate the texture of the fracture surfaces, and adhere to them, will take on the exact geometry of the loss, not because the filling material was shaped to fit, because the space itself determines the shape of whatever fills it. The gap is a mold. What enters it is cast by the loss. Urushi, the resin of a tree, processed, applied in layers, hardened by humidity rather than heat, is capable of this. It flows. It follows the gap's geometry. It adheres to the ceramic surfaces it contacts. It hardens slowly, over days, in the humid conditions that its chemistry requires. When it has hardened, it is not a patch on top of the fracture. It is inside the fracture, filling the gap from within, bonded to both surfaces simultaneously, holding them in relation to each other. The fracture is now filled. The vessel holds again. What holds it is not the ceramic. The ceramic fractured, and the fracture remains. The surface is still present on both sides of the resin. What holds it is the material that entered the gap and hardened there. Fine gold powder suspended in the final layer of resin. The gold does not change the mechanical function of the repair. The resin alone is sufficient to bond the fragments, to fill the gap, to restore the vessel's capacity to hold. The gold changes what the repair looks like. It makes the resin visible in a particular way, highly reflective, catching light that would otherwise pass over the surface without distinction. What becomes visible is the path of the fracture. The gold follows the gap because the gold is in the resin, and the resin follows the gap. Where the crack ran, gold now runs. Where the fracture turned, the gold line turns with it. The width of the gold line corresponds to the width of the gap at each point. Wider where material was lost, narrower where the surfaces were nearly continuous. The gold is not drawn onto the surface. It is the gap, filled with material that reflects light. To see the gold line is to see the fracture, not the fracture as it was, open, a gap in the material, an absence, but the fracture as a presence, as a filled thing, as the form that the crack left behind, now occupied by something that can be seen. The gold does not cover the fracture, it inhabits it. The shape of the line is the shape of the breaking, preserved exactly, legible from across the room. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The vessel before the fracture held one kind of record: the clay, the forming, the firing. These were present in the material as its current condition. The composition of the clay body, the minerals, the particle sizes, the way the particles were oriented by the forming process, the evidence of the firing, the degree of vitrification, the color changes caused by the kiln's atmosphere, the small imperfections that accumulated through the hours at temperature. All of this was present in the vessel, readable by the right instruments, present as the physical consequence of how the vessel was made. The fracture added to this record. The fracture surfaces record the stress that caused them, its direction, its magnitude relative to the material strength, the path it took through the ceramic body. These surfaces now exist inside the vessel, embedded in the resin layer, no longer open to examination but still present, their texture still intact, their information still held in the geometry of the interface between ceramic and fill. The repair added another record: the thickness of the resin layer at each point, a record of the gap width, which is a record of material loss, which is a record of the fracture event's local severity, the adhesion of the resin to the ceramic, a record of the surface chemistry of the fracture faces, of what the interior of the ceramic was composed of, the gold at the surface, a record of the repair itself, of the decision to fill rather than conceal, to make visible rather than hide. 3 records layered in the same object: the making, the breaking, the filling, each one present simultaneously, each one legible to those who know how to read the material. The vessel that holds these 3 records is not the same vessel that held only the first. It is more complex. It has more history. It contains more events compressed into its current condition. The fracture did not diminish the vessel's record. The fracture extended it. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. There is a quality to the gold line in low light. In strong light, it is bright. The gold reflects the light source directly, a line of high intensity against the matte ceramic surface around it. In low light, it holds what light there is with more fidelity than the ceramic does. The ceramic scatters, the gold gathers. As the light reduces, the gold line remains visible longer than the surface around it, a faint luminosity marking the path of the fracture against a surface that has begun to merge with the dark. The record is most legible when the light is leaving. Not because the gold changes, because the ceramic surface, which in full light provides contrast for the gold, becomes less distinct as the light decreases, and the gold's reflectivity, its tendency to return what light there is rather than scatter it, becomes the dominant property of the surface. What was one line among many visible features becomes, in the dimming, the most present thing. The fracture, which in daylight is visible as a feature of the surface, becomes in low light the structure of the surface, the thing by which the surface is known, the line that persists when other details have withdrawn. Place a hand on the vessel. The ceramic surface is smooth where it was not fractured, the same smooth it has been since the firing, unchanged by the breaking, because the breaking did not reach this portion of the surface. Near the gold line, the surface is different. The resin that filled the gap sits slightly above or slightly below the ceramic surface on either side. The two surfaces, when joined by the fill, are not perfectly flush. The difference is small. The fingers can find it. This is also information. The height of the resin relative to the ceramic on either side records the gap width and the shrinkage of the resin as it hardened. Where the gap was wide, the resin surface may be slightly depressed. The resin shrank as it cured and drew inward, leaving a shallow channel. Where the gap was narrow, the resin surface is nearly flush, the shrinkage too small to produce a detectable step. The fracture line is legible to touch in the dark when the gold is not visible, when the eye cannot find the repair. The fingers follow the path of the breaking along the vessel's surface, tracing the route that the crack took through the ceramic, reading the history of an instant that lasted less than a second and is recorded permanently as the material. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. Consider the gold line against what surrounds it. The ceramic surface on either side of the line is uniform. The same material throughout, the same color, the same texture, the same response to light. It does not record the fracture. The ceramic that did not crack is unchanged by the cracking that happened nearby. The fracture passed through the ceramic body, and the ceramic on either side of its path is the same ceramic it was before, unaltered, holding no evidence of what the fracture did to its neighbor. Only the line holds the record. This is the gold line's precise function, not to decorate a surface that would otherwise be plain, but to mark the location of an event that left no trace on the surfaces immediately beside it. The fracture occurred here. The ceramic on both sides does not show it. The line shows it because the line is inside it, because the line is made of the fill that the gap required, because the gap was the fracture's only physical legacy, and the gold is the gap made visible. The vessel announces its history, not loudly, not as declaration, as a line running across the surface, following the path that the physics of brittle fracture chose when the stress exceeded the threshold. The line does not say, "This broke." It shows where the breaking was. The difference between saying and showing is the difference between a label and a record. The gold line is a record. It holds the shape of the event in the shape of the material that filled it. Without the gold, the vessel would show a repair but not its path. The filled gap would be present, the resin, slightly different in texture from the surrounding ceramic, detectable to close attention. But the precise route of the fracture, the exact path the crack traveled, the record of how the breaking moved through the ceramic body, this would be present but not legible. The gold makes it legible. It renders in visible form the information that the fracture inscribed in the gap's geometry. The vessel rests in this room, in the still air, holding whatever it holds or holding nothing. Its function as a vessel is separate from its record as an object. It can hold things again. The repair is strong. The resin bonded to the ceramic, and the ceramic held the bond, and the vessel is again capable of the use it was made for. The fracture did not end its use. It interrupted it, and the interruption was filled, and the use resumed, now in a vessel that carries the record of the interruption inside it. What was broken is held together by what entered the break. This is the physical fact, stated plainly. The ceramic fractured, and the gap that resulted was filled with a material that hardened and bonded to both sides, and the vessel is now one thing again, not by any restoration of the original. The original ceramic is still fractured. The surfaces are still present on either side of the fill. The break is still there inside the repair. One thing, not by the removal of the break, but by the addition of something that spans it. The spanning material is visible. The break it spans is visible through the spanning material. Both are present. Neither conceals the other. Outside, the night continues. The air is still. The gold line on the vessel's surface holds the last available light without giving it back, gathering, not scattering, the faint remainder of the room's illumination into the path that the fracture left. The making is in the ceramic. The breaking is in the line. The filling is what the line is made of. All three are the vessel now. All three rest here together, in the dark, in the silence between one thing and whatever comes next. The vessel does not know it carries this history. There is no knowing in ceramic, no awareness of the record compressed into its current condition. What the vessel is tonight is simply the result of everything that happened to it. The forming and the firing, the fracture and the fill, each event present as the physical consequence it produced, all of them layered into the object that sits here in the stillness. The gold holds the last of the light. The ceramic holds the memory of the fire that made it. The resin holds the space where the breaking was. Each holds differently. Each holds what it can. Together, they are the vessel which holds all of it and holds it still. When night falls, the archive remains. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. The night is long, the air is still. Only what must continue, continues. A hollow column stands in the dark. Its walls are thin relative to its height. The interior is empty, not emptied, not carved out, but formed as empty. the hollow a consequence of how the structure grew, rather than something removed after growth was complete. The column did not begin as solid and become hollow. It was hollow from the first cellular division that established its form. Hollow as the structure extended upward. Hollow now, at its full height. The emptiness inside it as original as the walls that surround it. The walls are not uniform. At intervals along the height of the column, the wall material thickens into a disc, a node, a horizontal partition that interrupts the hollow interior, dividing the empty space into separate chambers. The disc is not decorative. It is structural. It is the place where the growth changed its rate, where what was extending rapidly paused in its extension, where the cellular activity that produced the wall also produced at that moment a crossmember, between one disc and the next, a chamber of air, between one chamber and the next, the record of a change in speed. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Growth in this plant is not continuous at a single rate. The extension of the culm, the technical name for the hollow stem, proceeds in pulses. Each pulse a period of rapid upward growth followed by a consolidation, a thickening of the wall at the point where the rapid growth ended. The rapid growth is cellular division and elongation, cells multiplying and then stretching, the structure extending upward as the new cells push the older ones higher. The consolidation is the laying down of structural material at the growth point, the thickening of cell walls, the deposition of the silica and lignin that give the mature structure its hardness. The node marks where consolidation happened, not where growth stopped. Growth did not stop at the node. Growth moved upward through the node and continued above it in the next internode, the next section of rapid extension. The node marks where the balance tipped, where the rate of upward extension slowed relative to the rate of wall thickening, where the structure briefly consolidated what the rapid growth had produced before the next pulse of extension began. Each node is the record of one such consolidation. Count the nodes on the culm, and you count the number of times the growth changed its mode, from extension to consolidation and back to extension. The nodes are not evenly spaced. A longer interval records a period of abundance, heat, moisture, the uninterrupted pressure of growth moving upward without resistance. A shorter interval is the physical record of a constraint, a cold night, a dry week, the point in the season when the conditions sustaining rapid extension began to withdraw. The culm does not describe these events, it becomes them. The spacing of the nodes is a graph built into the structure. The distances between consolidation points encoding the velocity of growth at each moment of the growing season. Run a hand along the culm from base to tip and you move through time. The slow establishment of the early weeks, the rapid extension of the peak, the closing intervals near the tip where the season was ending. The structure is the record. The record is the structure. Breath enters. Breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The wall of the culm is not uniform in its composition. At the outer surface, the cells are smaller and more densely packed. The vascular bundles, the structures that conduct water and nutrients through the plant, are concentrated here, near the outer wall, where the demands of growth required the most efficient distribution of resources. Inward from the outer surface, the cell density decreases. The cells become larger, the walls thinner, the structure less dense. The inner surface, where the wall meets the hollow interior, is the least dense of all. Large cells, thin walls, the minimum material necessary to maintain the boundary between the wall and the air inside. This gradient is not accidental. The outer density is the structural concentration, the fibers that resist bending, the vascular bundles that carry the water upward under tension, the silica deposits that harden the outer surface against abrasion. The inner sparseness is the consequence. What is not needed for structural performance or vascular function is not built. The wall is thick only where thickness serves a purpose, dense only where density provides a benefit, and the boundary between dense and sparse is not a line, but a gradient that encodes the functional requirements of each layer. To look at a cross-section of the wall is to see a decision, not a conscious decision. There is no consciousness in cellular growth, but a biological optimization, the distribution of material that growth, over millions of years of selection, arrived at for this structural problem. Tall, slender, hollow, with walls that are dense where stress concentrates and sparse where stress is low. The cross-section is the solution. The solution is visible in the cross-section. Consider the hollow. In a solid column of the same outer diameter, most of the material would be far from the outer surface, in the interior, contributing little to the resistance against bending. Bending stress concentrates at the outer surfaces of a column. The outer fibers carry the tension and compression that bending imposes. The interior carries little. A solid column wastes the material at its center, carrying it without using it. The hollow comb wastes nothing. The air inside the comb contributes nothing to the structural performance and requires nothing from it. Air has mass, but so little mass that the hollow comb is almost as light as if the interior truly contained nothing. And the structural material that would occupy the interior in a solid column is, in the hollow comb, not present, not needed, not grown, not available to add weight without adding strength. The hollow is not a deficit. The hollow is precision. The comb has material exactly where the structural demands require it, and nothing where structural demands do not. This is not the result of design in any intentional sense. It is the result of growth, which deposits material in response to the stresses imposed on developing tissue, which builds where building is needed and doesn't build where building would serve no purpose. The form that growth produced is the form that engineering would design. These two arrived at the same place by different means, one by intention, by calculation, by the deliberate arrangement of material to meet specified requirements, the other by cellular response to mechanical stimulus, by the accumulation over time of the growth patterns that survived because they were sufficient and discarded the growth patterns that did not survive because they were not. The hollow is the result of both processes expressed in one structure. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. At the node, the hollow is interrupted. The disk of denser material that forms the node is not a complete seal. There are passages through it, small channels through which the vascular bundles continue their path from one internode to the next. The node does not sever the connection between adjacent chambers. It modifies it. The rapid flow of air that would pass through a fully open hollow is slowed at the node, redirected through the channels, which are small and irregular, and impose a resistance that the open hollow does not. Wind entering the comb from the open tip travels downward through the chambers and finds, at each node, a reduced passage. The sound changes at each node, not dramatically. The comb is not an instrument designed to produce discrete pitches, but the acoustic behavior of the air column inside the comb is modified by the nodes, by the irregular passages through each disc, by the variation in internode length that the growth pattern produced. A wind that enters a comb with many nodes, closely spaced, encounters a different acoustic structure than a wind that enters a comb with few nodes, widely spaced. The sound produced by the wind in the first is different from the sound produced in the second, not in a way that could be predicted precisely from the node spacing, but in a way that is determined by it. The nodes shaped the sound before there was any sound to shape. The growth that produced the node spacing was complete long before wind found its way into this comb. The acoustic consequence of the node spacing was not audible while the growth was occurring. The calm grew in the absence of the wind that would, later, reveal what the growth had built. The structure was made. The sound came after. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The calm that stands tonight has been standing since its growth completed. Growth in this plant is front-loaded. The calm reaches its full height in a single growing season, within weeks in the most rapid phase of extension. What is the calm's full height at the end of that season is the calm's full height. The calm does not grow taller. It does not add height in subsequent years. It matures. The wall material hardens further as additional silica and lignin are deposited. The outer surface develops its characteristic sheen as the waxy coating thickens, but the geometry is fixed from the end of the first season. The number of nodes, the spacing of the internodes, the distribution of the hollow chambers, all of this was determined during the weeks of rapid growth and has not changed since. The record in the structure is a record of weeks. Weeks in which the conditions determine the growth rate, the temperature, the availability of water, the length of the day, the nutrient supply from the root system, and the growth rate determined the node spacing. And the node spacing became the structure. And the structure has persisted, unchanged in its geometry, through every season since. The growing season is over. The conditions that determined the structure are gone. The particular temperatures of those weeks, the particular rainfall, the particular length of daylight that initiated and sustained the rapid growth phase. None of those conditions are present now. They were present once, briefly, and the comb recorded them in its node spacing. And the node spacing has persisted, as the conditions have not. What the growing season was, is held in the structure of what it produced. Consider what this means for the structure standing now. The calm does not contain the growing season. It does not store the temperature of those weeks. the measure of the rainfall, the angle of light that fell on the emerging tip. These are gone. They were conditions, not materials, and conditions do not persist in the way materials persist. What persists is the consequence of those conditions, the node spacing that the growth rate produced, the internode length that the extension produced, the wall thickness that the structural demands of that particular height produced. The conditions are absent. Their consequence is here in the geometry of the structure they shaped. The season was the cause. The culm is the effect. The cause is gone. The effect remains. The conditions are absent. Their consequence is here. The plant does not describe these events. It becomes them. This is the particular kind of record that a growing structure makes. Not a record of the conditions themselves, but a record of their consequence. A record made not by inscription but by formation. The structure grew as it grew because the conditions were as they were, and the structure that resulted holds in its geometry the information that those conditions contained. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The calm is still in the night air, not motionless. The stillness of the air at this hour does not reach the base of the plant, where the root system connects this calm to the network of rhizomes, the horizontal roots that extend through the soil and link every culm to every other culm in the grove. The rhizome system is alive still, always, conducting water, distributing nutrients, sending out the growth points that will produce next season's new culms. The culm above ground is mature, finished, its growth complete. The system below ground is not finished, it is preparing. Next season's culm is not yet a culm. It is a growth point on a rhizome, a node on the horizontal root structure, a potential that the root system is accumulating resources to realize. When the season arrives, when the temperature reaches the threshold that triggers growth, when the day length signals that the growing period has begun, the growth point will activate and the new culm will emerge from the soil and extend upward day by day, at a rate that records the conditions of those days in the spacing of its nodes. The record will begin again, in a different culm, under conditions that will be similar to this year's but not identical. Different rainfall, different temperature curves, different soil moisture at the critical early weeks. The new culm's node spacing will be similar to the old culms but not the same. Each culm is a separate record of a separate growing season. The grove, which holds many culms of many ages, holds many records simultaneously. Each one a different season, each one slightly different from the others. The variation between them, a record of the variation between the years that produced them. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The calm rests in the still of this room, not in a grove. Here, in the dark, a single culm. The root system that produced it is absent. The rhizome network that connected it to the rest of the grove is absent. What remains is the culm alone, the hollow column, the nodes at their recorded intervals, the wall with its density gradient, the chambers of air sealed between the discs. The chambers hold air that has been held since the culm matured. Not the same air molecules. Air moves through the small passages in the nodes, through the open tip, through any imperfection in the wall. But the chambers themselves have held air continuously since the culm's growth ended. Air at roughly the same pressure as the surrounding atmosphere. Air that is exchanged slowly with the outside rather than rapidly. The air inside the culm is in the culm the way the culm is in this room. Present, occupying the space available, neither stored nor free. Outside, the night is quiet. The conditions that made this culm are years in the past. The growing season that determined these node spacings, these internode lengths, this distribution of density in the wall. That season ended and was followed by other seasons, each with its own conditions, each producing its own culms from the rhizome network, each adding a new record to the grove. This culm holds one season, the node's record when growth changed its rate. The internode lengths record how fast the growth was when it was fastest. The wall density records what the structure needed at each layer. The hollow records what the structure did not need. All of it fixed now, in the hardened material. All of it present in the geometry. All of it held in a structure that will not grow further, will not change its node spacing, will not redistribute its wall density, will only harden slightly further as the seasons continue, and darken at the surface, and become in time more completely what the first season made it. The record is complete. It was complete at the end of the growing season that produced it. It has been complete since. Nothing that has happened in the seasons between then and now has added to it or subtracted from it. The culm has been holding it, without effort, without intention, in the only way a structure can hold anything, by being the thing it became. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. When night falls, the archive remains. When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. The night is long, the air is still. Only what must continue, continues. The stone is lower in the center than at the edges, not by much, a few millimeters perhaps. The difference is not visible from a distance. The stone appears level, appears uniform, appears to be what it was when it was laid, a flat surface, cut and dressed to provide a stable footing at the entrance to a structure. Only close attention reveals the depression. Only a hand laid flat against the surface, or a straight edge placed across it, confirms what the eye suspects. The center has descended, relative to the edges, by an amount too small to trip on and too large to be original. The stone was not made this way. It was made flat. It was dressed flat. The surface worked until the irregularities of the quarried stone were removed, until a consistent plane was achieved, until the stone was ready to receive what would cross it. The flatness was the intended condition. The depression is what happened after. Between the intended condition and the current condition, use. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. Stone is hard. This is the property that makes it useful for thresholds. for the surfaces that receive the most concentrated contact of any element in a structure. A wooden threshold wears quickly, requires replacement, holds the memory of passage only briefly before the wood gives way entirely. Stone holds longer. Stone resists. But resistance is not refusal. Stone resists at a rate, and at that rate, over sufficient time, stone yields. What causes the yielding is friction. Every contact between the stone surface and whatever crosses it involves friction. The microscopic interaction between two surfaces in relative motion, the interlocking of surface irregularities, the force required to move one surface across the other. Friction generates heat locally at the points of contact. Friction dislodges particles, the smallest projections on the stone surface, the grains at the outer edge of the crystalline structure, the points where the surface is least supported by the material beneath. These particles detach. They become grit between the surfaces. The grit abrades further. Each crossing removes material measured in fractions of a grain, in amounts below the threshold of any single observation. No single crossing changes the stone. No 100 crossings change the stone in any way that attention could confirm. The stone after 1,000 crossings is, to every available measurement, the same stone it was before the first. The depression that is now visible, now confirmable by a hand laid flat, wasn't present after 1,000 crossings, nor after 10,000, nor in any way that could have been detected at the time, after 100,000. At some point, unannounced, the accumulated removal became a shape. The shape is not arbitrary. The depression follows the path that contact followed, deepest where contact was most frequent, most concentrated, most consistent. At the center of the stone, where the path across the threshold is most direct, where the weight of a body crosses most efficiently from one side to the other, the depression is deepest. Toward the edges, where contact was less frequent, where only those who passed close to the wall or carried something wide or moved differently from the usual path. The stone is higher, less worn, closer to the original surface. The depression is a map of the path, not the path as anyone planned it or described it. The path as it was actually traveled, repeated, accumulated over the years and decades and centuries that the stone has served this threshold. The architectural drawings that specified this stone showed a flat surface. No drawing showed the depression. The depression is the record of everything that happened after the drawing. The actual use, the actual movement, the actual distribution of weight and direction that no drawing could have captured, because no drawing was made from observation of the crossing itself. The stone holds what the drawing could not. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The deepest point of the depression is not at the geometric center of the stone. It is offset, toward the side from which most crossings approached, toward the line that the most frequent path described. The asymmetry is the record of a preference, not a conscious preference, not a decision made by any individual crossing, but the aggregate of 10,000 small adjustments, 10,000 slightly more efficient approaches, 10,000 bodies moving across this threshold on the path that the threshold's geometry and the structure's entrance made most natural. The asymmetry is the record of a habit that no one formed intentionally. A habit formed by a threshold, expressed in stone. Consider what was required to produce this shape. A single body crossing this threshold removes, in a lifetime of crossings, daily across decades, a quantity of stone too small to measure with ordinary instruments. The contribution of one person to the depression is below the threshold of detection. It cannot be isolated. It cannot be pointed to. No crossing can be identified as the one that made the depression deeper by any confirmable amount. And yet the depression exists. It was produced by crossings, each individually insufficient, collectively sufficient. The minimum number of crossings required to produce a depression of this depth, at the rate that foot traffic removes stone of this hardness, is not a number one person could generate. Not in a lifetime. Not in several lifetimes. The shape required more bodies than any individual could be, more time than any individual could span, more crossings than any single life contains. The shape is the record of a collective, not a collective that assembled for this purpose. No one assembled to wear the stone. Each crossing was individual, purposeful in its own direction, pointed at whatever lay on the other side of the threshold. The stone was not the destination. The stone was what had to be crossed to reach the destination. The wearing was incidental to every crossing that produced it. Every person who contributed to this shape was thinking of something else entirely. The shape is the residue of 10,000 purposes that had nothing to do with the shape. Consider the relation between intention and record that this produces. Every mark made deliberately, every inscription, every carving, every surface worked by a hand with a purpose is a record of intention. The intention preceded the mark. The mark was the intention's result. To read the mark is to recover, partially, the intention that made it, but the depression in this stone reverses that relation entirely. No intention preceded it. No one decided to make it. The crossings that made it were aimed elsewhere, at the rooms beyond, at the people expected, at the tasks that waited on the other side. The stone received the incidental weight of 1,000 intentions that were not about the stone at all. The depression is a record with no author, or rather, an author so distributed, so discontinuous, so composed of separate individuals across separate generations, that authorship dissolves into something closer to accumulation. The shape was made. It was made by crossings. The crossings were made by people, but no person made the shape, and no crossing made the shape, and the shape is nonetheless here, in the stone, undeniably made. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The pressure of a crossing is not uniform across the stone. A body in motion does not rest its weight evenly. The step arrives, shifts, transfers, departs. A wave of pressure moving through the foot from the first contact to the last, concentrating at the points of entry and exit, distributing across the middle. The full weight of a body in motion passing through a small area of stone in the time it takes to cross a threshold. The pressure varies. The stone yielded more where the pressure was greater, less where it was less. the differential too small to detect in any single crossing and detectable across 10,000 as the shape of the depression itself. This sequence was repeated at this threshold for every crossing. The depression encodes it, not as image, not as the outline of a foot. The stone did not receive an impression the way soft material receives an impression. The stone did not yield all at once, did not capture the shape of the contact in a single event. It yielded incrementally, grain by grain, crossing by crossing, each removal too small to constitute a shape, and the accumulated removal constituting exactly a shape, the shape of the average crossing, the mean of 10,000 individual pressure distributions, the record of how a body in motion transfers its weight through stone. The stone learned the step without being taught. The step left its record without intending to. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The edges of the stone are close to the original surface. Not untouched, the edges receive contact too, from those who pass close to the wall, from objects carried across the threshold, from the incidental contact of anything that crossed this boundary over the years. But the edges received less. The path favored the center, and the center received more, and the center descended more, and the edges remained closer to the original flat. The original surface exists at the edges. To place a hand at the edge of the stone and then move it toward the center is to move through time, from the surface as it was dressed, flat and intentional, toward the surface as use made it, curved and incidental. The distance between the original surface and the current surface at the deepest point is the measure of everything that crossed here, not the count. The count is not recoverable. The measure, the depth that the count produced in this stone, of this hardness, under these conditions, over this duration. The depth is not a number that means anything in isolation. It becomes meaningful in relation to what is known, the hardness of the stone, the rate at which this hardness yields to foot traffic, the depth of the depression. From these three, a duration can be estimated, rough, uncertain, dependent on assumptions about the frequency of crossing and the weight of those who crossed. The estimate is imprecise. The stone does not record the number directly. It records the consequence of the number, and from the consequence, the number can be approached but not recovered. The depression is a compressed history. The history is not fully legible. The compression is permanent. The stone is still tonight. No crossing since the last crossing. The surface that bore the step now bears only the air above it. The weight of the atmosphere, distributed evenly across the surface, far below the threshold of any further abrasion. The stone is not being worn tonight. It is resting in the shape that use made of it, holding the depression that accumulated crossing by crossing over the time this threshold has stood. The shape will not change tonight. It will not change tomorrow or in the season that follows, without the crossings that change it. The stone requires contact to continue its record. Without contact, the record holds at its current state. The depression at its current depth, the asymmetry at its current offset, the edges at their current approximation of the original surface. The stone does not continue to change in the absence of what changed it. This is particular to the stone's kind of record. The change requires the crossing. The record accumulates only when something arrives at the surface and moves across it. Between crossings, the stone is unchanged, not resisting change, not preparing for it, simply not the conditions that produce it. It holds what the crossings made and waits, in the way stone waits, for the next condition to arrive. The intervals between contact are most of the stone's existence. Use is the exception. Rest is the condition. The crossings that produced this depression were brief, a second each, perhaps two, the time it takes a body to move from one side of a threshold to the other. Between crossings, minutes, hours, sometimes longer. Between the last crossing of one day and the first crossing of the next, a night. Between the last crossing of one season and the first of the next, weeks, in places where the structure stood empty and unused, and the stone held its shape through the cold or the heat without anything crossing it at all. The stone spent most of its existence exactly as it is now, bearing only the air, holding its shape, neither wearing nor recovering, simply present at the boundary in the interval between one contact and the next. The contact is what the stone is known for. The interval is what the stone mostly is. Breath enters, breath leaves. Between breaths, the air holds its density. The threshold is still. The structure it belongs to stands as it stood when the stone was laid. The entrance is where it was. The path that leads to the threshold leads to it still. Tomorrow the crossings will resume. The same path, the same transfer of weight, the same fractional removal of material from the same surface, deeper at the center, shallower at the edges, continuing the depression that 100 years of crossings have already made. Each tomorrow's crossing will add to what all previous crossings made, not noticeably, not in any way that a single day's crossings could demonstrate. But the addition will be real, will be present in the stone, will deepen the depression by amounts that accumulate across decades into amounts that matter. The stone that was flat when it was laid will be, in another 100 years, deeper at the center than it is tonight, closer at the edges to the original surface than it will be at the center, more asymmetric in the direction that the predominant path describes. The record is not finished. Every threshold that is still in use is a record still being written. The shape still changing, the depth still increasing, the asymmetry still developing in the direction that use determines. The stone does not know the record is unfinished. The stone does not know anything. The stone holds its current shape and yields to the next crossing as it yielded to the last, by fractions, without decision, at the rate that friction and hardness and the weight of a body in motion require. What will be written is what will cross. What has been written is what crossed. The depression holds both. The crossings of the past, present as depth, and the crossings of the future, present as the capacity to receive them. The surface still hard enough to hold its shape between crossings and still soft enough, relative to what crosses it, to yield by fractions when the crossing comes. The stone does not distinguish between these two kinds of holding. It does not hold the past differently from how it holds the future. It holds its current shape, which is the past, and it holds its current hardness, which is the future's condition. Both are the same stone, the same surface, the same material resting in the dark at the entrance to the structure, at the boundary between outside and inside, at the place where passage concentrates because passage must concentrate somewhere. And this is where it has always concentrated, and the stone has always been here to receive it. The stone rests in the dark, at the entrance, in the shape that passage made of it, holding that shape through the night, through the interval between the last crossing and the first, through the stillness that is most of what a threshold is. Not the crossing, but the waiting between crossings, the stone present at the boundary, shaped by what has passed through it, open to what has not yet come. The depression is here. The crossings that made it are not here. What remains of them is only this, the shape they left in something harder than themselves. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. When night falls, the archive remains.